Think less but see it grow. Like a ride, oh. Not easily offended. Not hard to let it go. From a mess to the masses. A list of many, think less but see it grow. Like a ride, oh. Not easily.
Hello? Hello?
We still got 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Now that you're lonely, do let, juggle it, do let's go slowly discouraged. We'll burn the pictures instead. When it's all over, we can barely discuss for 1 minute only. Not with a fortune and only. Thought it could have been something else. These days it comes and goes. A list of many, think less but see it grow. Like a ride, oh. Not easily offended. Not hard to let it go. From a mess to the masses. A list of many, think less but see it grow. Like a ride, oh. Not easily offended. Not hard to let it go. From a mess to the masses. This is showtime, this is showtime, this is showtime. This is showtime, this is showtime, this is showtime. Time to show it up, it's time to show it up. Time to show it up, it's time to show it up. From a mess to the masses, a list of many, think less but see it grow. Like a ride, oh. Discuss.
Turn your magic on. With me, she'd say everything you want to dream away. We are legends every day. That's what she told me. Turn your magic on. To me, she'd say everything you want to dream away. Under this pressure, under this weight. We are diamonds, and I feel my heart beating. I feel my heart underneath my skin. I feel my heart beating. You make me feel like I'm alive again. Alive again. Oh, you make me feel like I'm alive again. Said I can't go on, not in this way. I'm a dream that died by light of day. Gonna hold up high the sky and say alive again. Oh, you make me feel like I'm alive again. Turn your magic on, and me she'd say everything you want to dream away. Under this pressure, under this weight, we are diamonds taking shape. We are diamonds taking shape. If we've only got this life, this adventure over and if we've only got this life, you get me through. If we've only got this life and this adventure over wanna share it with you, with you.
I got this feeling inside my bones. It goes electric wavy when I turn it on. All through my city, all through my home. We're flying up, no ceiling when we in our zone. I got that sunshine in my pocket, got that good soul in my feet. I feel that hot blood in my body when it drops. Ooh, I can't take my eyes off of it, moving so phenomenally. You're more like the way we rock it, so don't stop. And under the lights when everything goes, nowhere to hide when I'm getting you close. When we move, well you already know. So just imagine. Nothing I can see but you when you dance, dance, dance. Feel good, good creeping up on you. So just dance, dance, dance. Come on. All those things I shouldn't do, but you dance, dance, dance.
Hello, hello, testing. If I could get everyone's attention. Hello, everyone. My name's Tim. I will be your moderator. Today, we are very honored to have Father Andrew Damick. Father Damick is an archpriest of the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese of North America, pastor of St. Paul Antiochian Orthodox Church of Emmaus, Pennsylvania, a husband, and a father of 4 children. He is also the author of 3 books from Ancient Faith Publishing, Orthodoxy and Heterodoxy, An Introduction to God, and Bearing God, a blogger and the host of 4 Ancient Faith radio podcasts, Amon Sul, The Areopagus, Road from Emmaus, and Orthodoxy and Heterodoxy. Father Andrew was raised as a son of evangelical Protestant missionaries and became an Orthodox Christian while in college in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's a 2007 summa cum laude, graduate of St. Tikhon Seminary, and has been a priest since 2006, being raised to the dignity of archpriest recently in 2016. Besides his love for the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, he has a keen love for evangelism and education and is an extremely amateur keeper of trees. He loves language, especially the English language, and nurtures a geek-level enthusiasm for both Star Trek and Star Wars. Please help me in welcoming Father Andrew Damick.
All right, I got one. Thanks. All right, before we begin, I just need to see what kind of crowd you are. So how many have read The Lord of the Rings? How many have only seen the movies? How many have done neither? Shameful, slow hands. Well, my hope is for those of you who just raised your hands there at the end, that you will slide into the first category by the time we're done with this talk. And those of you who have only seen the movies, you have some work to do, okay? So I need you to do some reading. The books are way better. Yes. So I suppose that a good Tolkien talk ought to begin with a bit of word study. Professor J.R. Tolkien was, after all, a philologist by profession, and an Old English philologist in particular. And so as I saw this talk being promoted, it became clear to me that this one in particular had need of this. You see, it seems as the title, Faithful Hearts, Froward Tongues, was made public, that a goodly number of comments on social media kindly advised the promoters that they had a typographical error in their promotional materials. They were being warned that they had misspelled the word forward. I will say, first of all, that if you are one of the people who graciously let the promoters know that they had misspelled forward, then I forgive you. But if after listening to this talk you do it again, as to whether forgiveness might come for you once more, I will leave that in God's hands. As far as I can tell, this word froward appears just once in the whole Tolkien Legendarium. In The Lord of the Rings, in the volume titled The Two Towers, in Book 3, Chapter 6, which is titled The King of the Golden Hall. It's not in The Hobbit. It's not in the Silmarillion. I also couldn't find it in any of the various lesser-known works of the Legendarium, nor even in the many drafts of its development in the 12-volume History of Middle-earth series, nor yet in the published letters from the professor. This apparent uniqueness of usage surprised me somewhat because froward is a word that I have to imagine that Tolkien would have loved. It begins with a word from Old Norse, which in its earliest introduction into English was pronounced fra and spelled F-R-A. And fra meant away from, okay? Away from. Roughly similar to the Greek apo, right? Fra gets combined with the native Old English term weird, which came via Proto-Germanic from an earlier Indo-European word that meant turn or bend. Thus, the Old English weird was to be facing toward or turn toward. From this, we get the sense of ward and warden, which we still have in modern English, also with guard and guardian, which should not be at all surprising because guard itself is from the same Old Germanic root, coming back into English via Old French. So we now have ward and guard, meaning basically the same thing, and ending up in modern English as two words. But ward has been retained as a suffix, meaning in the direction of, thus giving us words like toward, backward, eastward. You following me so far? All right. You're almost philologists now. This is good. So the early froward had the sense of being turned away from. And as it made its way into Middle English, which is that period of English between Old English and what we speak now, modern English, as the initial vowel shifted to an O and gave us the form that we have now, froward, okay? Thus, using the word in English that best keeps this initial sense of fra, namely from, you can use fromward as a kind of mnemonic device as to what froward really means. Another way to remember this remarkable word is to recall that if fro is the opposite of to, as in the expression to and fro, right? Then froward is the opposite of toward. Bet you never thought about to and fro very much before, did you? That fro, it means something. It is something of a sadness that froward should be mistaken for forward, because they mean, well, if not opposite things, at least sort of perpendicular things. To move froward is to move away from something or someone, but to move forward is simply to go in the direction that you're facing. That said, though, if one knows all of these words well, one might turn toward the backward eastward and advance forward so as to move froward. That was much funnier to the first session. You guys need a little more coffee or something, I don't know. But if you think that delights me, well, you might well be right, and indeed there would be nothing untoward about that thought. These jokes are not doing well in this room. Man, how many English majors do we have here? They're all concentrated mostly. That's interesting. This is sort of like, yeah, a couple of, that's good. You guys need to lead the laughs, okay? I'm depending on you, fellow English majors. Although you're not English majors anymore if you graduated. You're graduates. All right. Anyway. All of that brings us to the use of froward that is in Tolkien's Legendarium. You see, froward is not merely a word that means turned away from in the literal sense. Okay? Like untoward, it is also used in a metaphorical sense, and indeed is almost a synonym of untoward. If you behave in an untoward manner, you are being rude. That is one way of acting froward, of course, but froward as a metaphor is broader, as the Oxford English Dictionary tells us, meaning disposed to go counter to what is demanded or reasonable, perverse, difficult to deal with, hard to please, refractory, ungovernable, bad, evilly disposed, and here's my favorite one, naughty. It thus ultimately strikes me as wonderfully serendipitous that froward should be mistaken for forward, because its reception is thus fulfilling its sense. That is, froward taken for forward is itself a rather froward happenstance. It is something that does not quite fit, that goes counter, that is perverse, and perhaps froward is itself froward in the sense of not being what people expect it to be. People who expect forward, but are frowardly being given froward instead. Clear? Now, I mention all of this not just to indulge in a bit of philology. Although, again, this is a Tolkien talk, so this is almost obligatory. Rather, my point is that the froward reception of the title of this talk has actually introduced us to the problem and perhaps some of the solution that I wish to discuss today. This talk is named for a line in The Two Towers, the second volume of The Lord of the Rings. I hope you've read it, because this line doesn't make it into the movie, actually. So in case you haven't, however, or if perhaps it's been a long time, I'll give a little bit of background to bring you up to speed. In the book, the kingdom of Rohan had been weakened by influence from the traitor wizard Saruman, who had been influencing the king Theoden by means of an agent in his court named Grima Wormtongue. You can guess from that name he's not a good guy. The good wizard Gandalf comes to Edoras, Theoden's royal hall, and essentially cures Theoden of this influence, which in the book is a rather more subdued scene than the exorcism of sorts that we see in the Peter Jackson film, which is nonetheless effective. With this cure complete, Theoden returns to his full kingly manhood. He comes to himself and receives his boldness and leadership back, becoming now ready to defend his people against evil and even to ride forth in defense of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. As a result, he banishes Wormtongue, who had held sway over him for so long. During the time of Saruman's influence over Theoden, he had successfully driven a wedge between him and his nephew, Éomer, who was a major leader of the Rohirrim, the riders of Rohan, who protected the kingdom and fought its wars. So now I will read to you from The Two Towers, picking up right after Wormtongue is banished. "Now, my guests, come," said Theoden. "Come and take such refreshment as haste allows." They passed back into the great house. Already they heard below them in the town the heralds crying and the war horns blowing. For the king was to ride forth as soon as the men of the town and those dwelling near could be armed and assembled. At the king's board sat Éomer and the 4 guests. There also waiting upon the king was the lady Éowyn. They ate and drank swiftly. The others were silent while Theoden questioned Gandalf concerning Saruman. "How far back his treachery goes, who can guess?" said Gandalf. "He was not always evil. Once I do not doubt that he was the friend of Rohan, and even when his heart grew colder, he found you useful still. But for long now he has plotted your ruin, wearing the mask of friendship until he was ready. In those years, Wormtongue's task was easy, and all that you did was swiftly known in Isengard, for your land was open, and strangers came and went, and ever Wormtongue's whispering was in your ears, poisoning your thought, chilling your heart, weakening your limbs, while others watched and could do nothing, for your will was in his keeping. But when I escaped and warned you, then the mask was torn, for those who would see, After that, Wormtongue played dangerously, always seeking to delay you, to prevent your full strength being gathered. He was crafty, dulling men's wariness or working on their fears as served the occasion. Do you not remember how eagerly he urged that no man should be spared in a wild goose chase northward when the immediate peril was westward? He persuaded you to forbid Amer to pursue the raiding orcs. If Amer had not defied Wormtongue's voice, speaking with your mouth, those orcs would have reached Isengard by now bearing a great prize. Not indeed that prize which Saruman desires above all else, but at the least 2 members of my company, sharers of a secret hope, of which even to you, Lord, I cannot yet speak openly. Dare you think of what they might now be suffering, or what Saruman might now have learned to our destruction? I owe much to Amer, said Theoden. Faithful heart may have froward tongue. Say also, said Gandalf, that to crooked eyes truth may wear a wry face. Indeed, my eyes were almost blind, said Theoden. Most of all I owe to you, my guest. Once again you have come in time. I would give you a gift ere we go, at your own choosing. You have only to name aught that is mine. I reserve now only my sword. Whether I came in time or not is yet to be seen, said Gandalf. But as for your gift, Lord, I will choose one that will fit my need, swift and sure. Give me Shadowfax. He was only lent before, if loan we may call it, but now I shall ride him into great hazard, setting silver against black. I would not risk anything that is not my own, and already there is a bond of love between us. You choose well, said Theoden, and I give him now gladly, yet it is a great gift. There is none like to Shadowfax. In him one of the mighty steeds of old has returned, none such shall return again. And to you, my other guests, I will offer such things as may be found in my armory. Swords you do not need, but there are helms and coats of mail of cunning work. Gifts to my fathers out of Gondor. Choose from these ere we go, and may they serve you well. So we hear that line. I owe much to Eomer, said Theoden. Faithful heart may have froward tongue. What does Theoden mean by this? Faithful heart may have froward tongue. It sounds like an aphorism, which suggests that this may be a saying in Rohan. Something passed down over generations, a piece of wisdom distilled into an axiomatic phrase, something that should be remembered. So what is this wisdom? To understand this, we need to look at a passage a bit earlier in this chapter, from immediately after Gandalf cures Theoden of his weakness and the influence of Saruman through Wormtongue. And here's Theoden speaking. Dark have been my dreams of late, he said. But I feel as one new awakened. I would now that you had come before Gandalf, for I fear that already you have come too late, only to see the last days of my house. Not long now shall stand the high hall which Brego, son of Eorl, built. Fire shall devour the high seat. What is to be done? Much, said Gandalf. But first send for Eomer. Do I not guess rightly that you hold him prisoner by the counsel of Grima, of him that all save you name the Wormtongue? It is true, said Theoden. He had rebelled against my commands and threatened death to Grima in my hall. A man may love you and yet not love Wormtongue or his counsels, said Gandalf. So we see that Theoden had Eomer imprisoned because Eomer disobeyed him and threatened to kill Grima Wormtongue. But he releases Eomer on Gandalf's counsel. And Gandalf delivers this line. A man may love you and yet not love Wormtongue or his counsels. So Gandalf is here saying to Theoden that Eomer loved him truly. That is, Eomer's heart was faithful to his king and uncle, even though he was disobeying him. Eomer's love for Theoden led him to disobey his words because they had come ultimately from Wormtongue. So this is the meaning of Theoden's comment then. Faithful heart may have froward tongue. Eomer's heart was faithful to him even while he spoke against him and even disobeyed him. But Theoden has to come to this realization, restoring Eomer's freedom and reconciling with him. Now let's look a little bit deeper here. Theoden did not simply obey Gandalf when he showed up and told him, among other things, to release Eomer. Rather, he gave an excuse for why he had had Eomer imprisoned. Even though Wormtongue's deceit had been laid bare, Theoden still retained his feeling of being wronged by Eomer. Having been cured of the influence of Saruman, Theoden did not immediately reverse all his worm-tongue advised decisions. Indeed, he still felt the sting of Éomer's apparent betrayal. I'm also fascinated here that after Theoden recites what I take to be a maxim among the Rohirrim, Gandalf delivers one of his own. Say also that to crooked eyes, truth may wear a wry face. The word wry here, spelled W-R-Y, not R-Y-E. You know where a rye is? It's not bread. Rye is not... Good, yeah, come on, laugh a little. Thank you, please. It's not one we use too much these days, rye, but it essentially refers to an ironic or even mocking or scornful expression, right? This also comes off as an aphorism, and it means essentially that if you're not seeing things correctly, then the truth may be painful to encounter. In Theoden's case, his vision had been altered by the influence of Saruman, and so the truth that was in Éomer's heart appeared painful to him, froward even. The final thing I wanted to pay attention to in this scene is how Theoden's cure is finally completed through generosity. Generosity. He offers armor to his guests who are being led by Gandalf, and he gladly gives up Shadowfax to the wizard, who is essentially the greatest horse in the world. Theoden's healing is completed not by immediately riding into battle, although there is a passage in the chapter when some of his men think that that's what he's about to do. But it's rather completed by generosity. The illness that Theoden had was one in which his eye was only on his own land and his own possessions. He did not want Éomer to ride after the orcs because he was afraid for the defense of Rohan, and so he wanted him kept close. The manner in which Wormtongue poisoned Theoden's soul was to make him selfish, self-centered, and self-contained. Such an attitude lashes out at others and has to control them, which is why Éomer gets imprisoned. So the full cure here is manifest not by going into battle. Theoden does indeed go into battle later and gives his life there, the ultimate expression of generosity and self-sacrifice. If his illness had been about cowardice, we could see going into battle perhaps as evidence of the cure. But the illness was about weakening his kingly resolve by distorting his vision, by making him inward-looking. And so it is in this final act within this chapter that Theoden shows that he is fully himself now once again, an act of generosity. Let's turn now to another relationship in The Lord of the Rings that was broken based on failing to see someone's heart and looking only to his froward behavior. This brokenness lasted a good bit longer, however, some 30 years. And I'm speaking here of Frodo Baggins and Farmer Maggot. Any Farmer Maggot fans? All right, I'm going to change that now. All right. You won the one fan? Good. Good for you. You know. She knows something she hasn't told the rest of you. All right. Farmer Maggot is one of the lesser-sung heroes of The Lord of the Rings. And except for a very brief frightened exchange with a ring wraith, he doesn't make it into the movies. The four hobbits' encounter with him in the Fellowship of the Ring before they leave the Shire proper is significant, however, and there is far more to him than we might be tempted to think even after reading that encounter. We should recall, for instance, the reverential way that Tom Bombadil spoke of him. He said, "There's earth under his old feet and clay on his fingers, wisdom in his bones, and both his eyes are open." Now, coming from Tom Bombadil, that is high praise indeed. And if you don't know who Tom Bombadil is, again, you need to read the books. Sorry, I don't want to feel like I'm scolding you, just encouraging you to read something that's so awesome. We're also informed that Tom gets a lot of his news about the Shire from Farmer Maggot, presumably not just because they're neighbors, what with Maggot being situated on the eastern edge of the Shire, next to the Old Forest, but because he is, in Tom's estimation, someone worth talking to. The hobbits themselves discovered, and so we do too, as the text says, that Tom saw Maggot as, quote, a person of more importance than they had imagined. They just thought he was some farmer dude on the eastern edge of the Shire. So, in case you're having trouble remembering what I'm talking about, here's the passage from The Lord of the Rings that sets all of this up. They passed along the edge of a huge turnip field and came to a stout gate. Beyond it, a rutted lane ran between low, well-laid hedges towards a distant clump of trees. Pippin stopped. "I know these fields and this gate," he said. "This is Bam Furlong, old Farmer Maggot's land. That's his farm away there in the trees." "One trouble after another," said Frodo, looking nearly as much alarmed as if Pippin had declared that the lane was the slot leading to a dragon's den. The others looked at him in surprise. "What's wrong with old Maggot?" asked Pippin. "He's a good friend to all the Brandybucks. Of course, he's a terror to trespassers and keeps ferocious dogs. But after all, folk down here are near the border and have to be more on their guard." "I know," said Frodo, "but all the same," he added with a shamefaced laugh, "I am terrified of him and his dogs. I have avoided his farm for years and years. He caught me several times trespassing after mushrooms when I was a youngster at Brandy Hall. On the last occasion, he beat me and then took me and showed me to his dogs. 'See, lads,' he said, 'next time this young varmint sets foot on my land, you can eat him. Now see him off.' They chased me all the way to the ferry. I have never got over the fright, though I dare say the beasts knew their business and would not really have touched me." Pippin laughed. "Well, it's time you made it up, especially if you're coming back to live in Buckland. Old Maggot is really a stout fellow, if you leave his mushrooms alone. Let's get into the lane, and then we shan't be trespassing. If we meet him, I'll do the talking. He's a friend of Mary's, and I used to come here with him a good deal at one time." So here we have the froward behavior that defines Frodo's relationship to Farmer Maggot before the hobbits meet him in the book. So all of this, it's all a flashback. It's all happened way in the past. Certainly, Frodo was himself misbehaving via trespassing and theft. So you could say that he deserved the beating and the fright from the dogs, and clearly he later acknowledged that. But notice what he says. "I've never got over the fright, though I dare say the beasts knew their business and would not really have touched me." In other words, he knew that Maggot was just trying to scare him from stealing his mushrooms again and not trying to harm him. But even with 30 years since that experience, when Frodo would have been in his tweens, what hobbits call the irresponsible 20s, between childhood and coming of age at 33. Any tweens here? He was still carrying this fear around with him after all these years. And based on that fear, he eschewed having a relationship with Maggot, avoiding his farm for years and years. So when they actually do meet, Frodo is reintroduced to Maggot by Pippin, and Frodo's fear again arises, but Maggot has current events in mind. Listen, Pippin introduced the other two to the farmer. "Mr. Frodo Baggins," he said. "You may not remember him, but he used to live at Brandy Hall." At the name Baggins, the farmer started and gave Frodo a sharp glance. For a moment, Frodo thought that the memory of stolen mushrooms had been aroused, and that the dogs would be told to see him off. But Farmer Maggot took him by the arm. "Well, if that isn't queerer than ever," he exclaimed. "Mr. Baggins, is it? Come inside. We must have a talk." All Frodo can think of is those dogs, but instead Maggot welcomes him and the other hobbits into his home. Our first clear indication of his faithful heart. What follows is Maggot giving them hospitality, making some shrewd guesses about what their business is with the ringwraiths, and then finally offering and giving them help to see them on their way. It's clear that the farmer doesn't really know about the ring itself, but he seems to understand enough to realize that helping the hobbits is the right thing to do. And he clearly holds no grudge against Frodo for his trespassing and thieving all those years before. Frodo finally realizes that he's been wrong all these years, saying, as it's nearing time for them to leave, "Thank you very much indeed for your kindness. I've been in terror of you and your dogs for over 30 years, Farmer Maggot, though you may laugh to hear it. It's a pity, for I've missed a good friend. And now I'm sorry to leave so soon, but I'll come back perhaps one day if I get a chance." Frodo's comment, "I've missed a good friend," echoes Pippin's earlier statement, "He's a good friend to all the Brandybucks." So you get the sense that the narrator is trying to tell us Maggot is a good friend, right? You see these repetitions, you should get clued in, yeah. So again, we see how a faithful heart may be expressed in a froward tongue. Farmer Maggot's toughness is justified by his closeness to the border of the Shire, closeness to the realm of chaos and danger. Frodo did not take this into account when he was young and hungry for mushrooms. But Maggot was also acting in something of a fatherly role when he disciplined the tween-age Frodo, who'd been stealing his mushrooms. Such paternal care only continued with the encounter with Frodo some 30 years later. And indeed, in this we may see an image of the prodigal son, though of course not in every respect. Frodo's prodigality is expressed against this father and not away from him, right? He's not leaving him, but against him. But he's nonetheless welcomed back by Farmer Maggot and even told, "You'll be welcome when you come." And with this welcome comes not the killing of the fatted calf, but hospitality nonetheless, which is crowned at the end with a gift of mushrooms. The very thing that Frodo had sought to steal so many years before is now given as gift. We may be reminded here also of Eden and how being like God was to be given by God as gift and not taken at will. No guardian angel with a flaming sword drives the hobbit away, but rather Farmer Maggot's dogs. In this example, the froward tongue is not an apparently rebellious son toward a father figure, as it was with Éomer toward his uncle Theoden, but is rather a stern father figure toward a wayward young hobbit. So it's flipped as compared to Theoden and Éomer. Frodo's failure to see past the sternness of Farmer Maggot cost him 30 years of friendship, even good friendship. But nonetheless, healing can occur even if the clock cannot be turned back. Frodo sees through his fear of Farmer Maggot to the farmer's faithful heart, a stout friendship that was known to the Brandybucks and, of course, now to Frodo as well. For my third and final example of a faithful heart with a froward tongue, I wanted to look at the relationship of Boromir, son of Denethor, the steward of Gondor, and Galadriel, the Lady of Lothlorien. This tension is perhaps one of the more noteworthy in the Tolkien Legendarium, in which one of the protagonists is set at odds with another major good figure based on a failure to see her true heart. This relationship is different from the previous two we just discussed in that Boromir actually has no personal relationship with Galadriel before he meets her in Lothlorien. Unlike with Theoden and Éomer, who are intimates and even close family, or with Frodo and Farmer Maggot, who are connected both by encounter and by the complex web of relationships and relations that define hobbits in the Shire, Boromir's initial relationship with Galadriel is with only a legend. A legend. It is in that legend that the frowardness lies. We first encounter that relationship shortly after the escape from Moria, when Aragorn is about to lead the Fellowship into Lothlorien. So this is right after Gandalf dies in Moria, grappling in combat with the Balrog, right? And they said, "We've lost our hope," and Aragorn says, "Then we must do without hope." So that's what's just happened. Aragorn begins moving in the direction of Lothlorien, and he expects everyone to follow him. And here's where we pick up. He stepped forward, but Boromir stood irresolute and did not follow. "Is there no other way?" he said. "What other fairer way would you desire?" said Aragorn. "A plain road, though it led through a hedge of swords," said Boromir. "By strange paths has this company been led, and so far to evil fortune. Against my will we pass under the shades of Moria to our loss. And now we must enter the Golden Wood, you say. But of that perilous land we have heard in Gondor, and it is said that few come out who once go in, and of that few none have escaped unscathed. Say not unscathed, but if you say unchanged, then maybe you will speak the truth," said Aragorn. "But lore wanes in Gondor, Boromir, if in the city of those who once were wise they now speak evil of Lothlorien. Believe what you will, there is no other way for us, unless you would go back to Moria Gate, or scale the pathless mountains, or swim the great river all alone." "Then lead on," said Boromir, "but it is perilous." "Perilous indeed," said Aragorn, "fair and perilous. But only evil need fear it, or those who bring some evil with them. Follow me." So this last line from Aragorn, we have to ask ourselves whether Boromir is himself evil, or brings some evil with him. We know, of course, that he is tempted by the ring and tries much later to take it from Frodo. But I don't think the answer to this question, is Boromir evil? Is he bringing evil with him? Here is yes. I don't think it's yes. Certainly we get the sense that Boromir is somewhat brash and has something to prove, but his self-sacrificial death proves what kind of man he is. So I don't read this as the narrator telling us that Boromir is evil or has brought evil with him, only that he doesn't know what he's talking about when he says that Lothlorien is perilous. Boromir comes by his wariness of Lothlorien honestly. This is the lore that he has inherited, in which he has no reason to disbelieve. And for him, the Lady Galadriel is essentially the personification of the place. She is the sorceress of the Golden Wood, as the Rohirrim call her. At the first encounter that the Fellowship have with Galadriel, there is no specific mention of any interaction directly with Boromir, but we do get his impressions afterward, right? So a lot of this happens sort of off camera, so to speak, even in the book. Here's what Boromir says. "To me it seemed exceedingly strange," said Boromir. "Maybe it was only a test, and she thought to read our thoughts for her own good purpose. But almost I should have said that she was tempting us and offering what she pretended to have the power to give. It need not be said that I refused to listen. The men of Minas Tirith are true to their word." But what he thought that the lady had offered him, Boromir did not tell. And as for Frodo, he would not speak, though Boromir pressed him with questions. "She held you long in her gaze, Ring-bearer," he said. "Yes," said Frodo, "but whatever came into my mind then, I will keep there." "Well, have a care," said Boromir. "I do not feel too sure of this elvish lady and her purposes." "Speak no evil of the Lady Galadriel," said Aragorn sternly. "You know not what you say. There is in her and in this land no evil unless a man bring it hither himself. Then let him beware. But tonight I shall sleep without fear for the first time since I left Rivendell. And may I sleep deep and forget for a while my grief. I am weary in body and in heart." He cast himself down upon his couch and fell at once into a long sleep. And we should say, of course, that the reason that Aragorn feels so comfortable in Lothlorien is because he had lived there for a while, actually, and Galadriel is his future grandmother-in-law. That's right. Arwen is her granddaughter. It's her daughter that marries Elrond. And by the way, as another side note, did you know that Aragorn and Arwen are in fact first cousins 67 times removed? So they are related, but she's about 2,700 years old when they meet, and he's about 20, and their courtship takes 60 years, and then they're married for 120. So, can you imagine being engaged for 60 years? It's pretty great. Yeah. Anyway, so sorry. I do have a tendency to kind of geek out a little bit when it comes to some of this stuff, because it's so awesome. So the last direct interaction that we have in the book between Boromir and Galadriel is when the Fellowship is preparing to leave Lothlorien. And we get this brief passage after Galadriel speaks with Aragorn first. "The lady bowed her head, and she turned then to Boromir, and to him she gave a belt of gold." So it might be thought that this relationship is left fully unresolved. Boromir has dark things to say about Galadriel even after he meets her, and one might again think that he had brought some evil with him into the Golden Wood, perhaps a desire for military victory or an overweening patriotism, right? But nothing in the text positively identifies Boromir as bringing evil with him or being evil, despite Aragorn's repeated warnings in this regard. What we get from Aragorn says more about Galadriel and her realm than it does about Boromir. So in what sense might it be said that Boromir sees beyond the froward tongue of Galadriel, the legend, really, of Galadriel, the truth that wears a wry face? She says and does nothing negative toward him, of course, but rather it is her reputation in the lore of Gondor that suffices here. Does Boromir ever see through this mistaken lore to Galadriel's faithful heart and realize that they're on the same side, both enemies of the one enemy, Sauron? I will argue that Boromir does indeed come to terms with his experience of Galadriel. Now, to be sure, he does not turn into her champion the way that Gimli does, arguing for her as the fairest of all ladies. That would be out of character for Boromir. Can you imagine him? kind of comical, right? So we don't get that. But we do get indications that he carries his encounter with Galadriel with him, and that it even is part of his final redemption and overcoming of temptation. So follow me here, okay? There is a detail that Tolkien includes twice after the self-sacrificial death of Boromir that suggests to me that the son of Denethor indeed made his peace with the Lady of the Golden Wood. We first see it when he is laid to rest in the boat by Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Now they laid Boromir in the middle of the boat that was to bear him away. The gray hood and elven cloak they folded and placed beneath his head. They combed his long dark hair and arrayed it upon his shoulders. The golden belt of Lorien gleamed about his waist. Now this detail is mentioned again when Boromir's brother Faramir has his waking vision of the boat with his body passing by him in the river Anduin. A broken sword was on his knee. I saw many wounds on him. It was Boromir, my brother, dead. I knew his gear, his sword, his beloved face. One thing only I missed, his horn. One thing only I knew not, a fair belt, as it were, of linked golden leaves about his waist. And Frodo explains to Faramir, that was indeed Boromir as I knew him, for the golden belt was given to him in Lothlorien by the Lady Galadriel. Faramir later laments and mentions Galadriel in particular in his lament, but not quite echoing his brother's earlier assessment of her. Boromir, O Boromir, he cried, what did she say to you, the lady that dies not? What did she see? What woke in your heart then? Why went you ever to Laurelin Doronin, and came not by your own road upon the horses of Rohan riding home in the morning? So Faramir sees Boromir's passage through the wood as not having left him unchanged, as Aragorn would put it, but perhaps also not unscathed, as Boromir named it. But he laments in questions and not in conclusions. Let's return to the belt, however, this final sign of Boromir's passing and his change. A belt is not just an ornament, even a golden one. For a warrior, it is a girding up and a reinforcement of his strength. That he received the belt from Galadriel, kept it with him, and we may assume wore it up until his death, suggests strongly that his heart toward Galadriel had changed. Remember how he had spoken of Galadriel before, that she was perilous and that none passed through the Golden Wood unscathed. If his heart had not changed toward her, then it would make no sense that he would wear the belt, or even that he would keep it. Gondorians are certainly not unsuperstitious people. I mean, receiving a golden belt from an elf witch? Oh yeah, let me just put that on. It would not matter that the belt was made of precious gold. The Boromir who saw the lady as somehow evil would not have kept nor worn such an item. So even though Faramir cries out in his lamenting, asking why Boromir ever went to Lorien, he also notices the golden belt. And Boromir's 3 companions who arrayed him thus for his funeral thought it important to include, and not at all out of character for him to be wearing even in death, in his final victorious pose with his enemy's weapons beneath his feet. So it was that even in death there was a witness to Boromir's reconciliation with Galadriel, perhaps mainly interior, but nonetheless authentic. His passage through Faerie showed him indeed neither unscathed nor unchanged. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, when the prophet Samuel is seeking out a king for Israel on behalf of God, the Lord says to him, "For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." In our time, we may often hear this idea applied mainly to physical appearance, which is the literal sense of this verse in Samuel's eyes, in Samuel's case. Samuel was looking at one of David's older brothers, a man named Eliab, and thought that he was surely the one. He was a big, impressive guy. But God said no, because he knew his heart and had chosen David. In this vein, we may hear that we should not judge a book by its cover, meaning that a person's quality is not determined by his physical appearance. Someone may be beautiful on the outside, but not on the inside, or he may be beautiful inside, yet not so attractive on the surface. Yet we read in many places that God knows men's hearts, and this knowledge is contrasted not only with physical appearance, but even with speech or behavior. For instance, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven." And in 1 Chronicles 28:9, God says to Solomon, "The Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intent of the thoughts." We looked at the story of how Theoden had to see the truth about Amer's faithfulness and love for him, and from that we saw that he had to come to a knowledge of Amer's heart and then act accordingly. We also saw how Frodo mistook the intentions and character of Farmer Maggot for all those years and only realized later that he had missed a good friend. We also saw how Boromir took a less obvious internal journey and discovered that the perilous Lady Galadriel of the Golden Wood was truly a faithful ally in the War of the Ring. For ourselves, it is also critical that we learn to look upon hearts as much as we are able. To look for faithfulness and love and not only to react to outward behavior. In some cases, outward behavior may even be bad. Amer openly disobeyed Theoden, for instance, and threatened one of his counselors with death. But there is also something beneath that we have to see. And it's often not easy to see that, even when the truth is laid bare. We may still experience the sting of what feels like opposition and betrayal. When on the receiving end of someone else's bad behavior, we can't assume that we're not under the influence of some Grima Wormtongue or other. All of us are in some way. All of us are being weakened in our ability to be creative, to see clearly, to be courageous. The Wormtongue in our own lives may not be an evil counselor, but could be our own passions, or of course also the demonic powers. And their message is always the same, just like Grima's. Have pity on me. Do not send me away. Look at all I've done for you. See how I always stand by you. Yet the test is that such thoughts never serve us when it comes time to look away from ourselves and to become what God would have us be. Theoden actually does not initially banish Grima Wormtongue, but invites him to go into battle with him. But Wormtongue fails that test and leaves, which is exactly the test that we must also apply when it comes to our thoughts and habits. Do they serve our riding forth into battle against the forces of evil in our hearts and lives, or do they serve our sitting down and doing nothing? When we apply this test of courage and generosity to our thoughts and habits that are actually beneficial to us, some may well wear a wry face, appearing to be painful or scornful, but that is only because we have crooked eyes. I have to imagine that even a father confessor or a truth-telling friend may wear a wry face when we have crooked eyes. The truth hurts. These and various other froward tongues may be expressed by faithful hearts. We have to look closely so that we can see the faithfulness of those hearts. Ultimately, the key to coming back to ourselves, to becoming more the persons that God would have us be, is through generosity, through selflessness, through self-sacrifice. Such acts are not only full evidence of our cure, but also part of the medicine itself. When we act in generosity, then our vision is cleared, and we gain back or grow our courage and creativity. In such acts, we do not become the hero of the story. We're not the hero. We're not the hero. Rather, we are opened to participation in the action of the true hero who saves the day and changes the world, who is Christ our true God, the returning King who is coming into the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father. I was one of the hands raised for not reading The Lord of the Rings. I had only watched the movies, but
But
next
now you
time,
want to read it, right?
Now, next time, is Audible acceptable to you? If not, if not, I will buy the book. But maybe.
Do what you have to do.
Okay. I will purchase Audible. I'll purchase the first one on Audible as soon as right after this one.
It's not like I get royalties from this one. Yeah, exactly.
So we have a little bit of time left. Open it up to any questions if you guys have any.
Questions, comments?
Questions, comments? Yeah.
It's really nice to see the symbolism between Christianity and Lord of the Rings. Did J.R.R. Tolkien, like, he intentionally did that, or are these things we're noticing after the fact?
So Tolkien, so the answer to your question briefly is yes, he did it on purpose. He actually says in a letter, one of his letters, which especially for those of you who have read, like, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion stuff, I recommend getting a copy of his letters, which are just awesome. In one of his letters, he says that the Lord of the Rings is a religious and Catholic work, first unconsciously and then consciously in the revision. Meaning that when he first wrote it, he had sort of naturally put Christian themes into it without thinking too much about it. But then as he was going over it and revising, he's like, how can I make this work even better? So he's very, very deliberate about it, even though, like, Christianity as such does not sort of show up. There's no, that's not happening exactly. But he says it's embedded in the narrative, right? There's practically a whole industry out there about talking about Tolkien in Christian terms. So, yeah, I mean, you can go on and on forever about it. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting because as someone who's read the books, I don't know why I never put two and two together with I knew he had Christian influence, but never put the two and two together with the Return of the King. And I know another author, I'm sure you're probably super familiar with his books as well, because in C.S. Lewis's works, Chronicles of Narnia, you clearly see the, like, Christian symbolism there, especially like the rising of Aslan and everything. Whereas, like, in this, I don't know why, I didn't put two and together ever sooner, especially with, like, the title of The Return of the King.
And the immortal words of Obi-Wan Kenobi, you've taken your first step into a larger world. But yes, with Lewis, right, it's very deliberate and allegorical, right? So to give you a good contrast, in Tolkien's works, there are many Christ figures. In Lewis's work, there is clearly a Jesus. Aslan is Jesus. And he comes right out and says it, really, at the end. Basically, yes, I'm known by another name in your world. He says that to the children. So you're meant to say, oh, there's Jesus. Whereas Tolkien, actually, if you read his the preface to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, he says that he cordially dislikes allegory wherever he detects it, but that he prefers instead something called applicability. And applicability he contrasts with allegory. He says that allegory is the purpose domination of the author. So the author is trying to make you see something. So, like, Lewis is trying to basically say, now here's Jesus, right? Which, I mean, that's cool. I come into that. But applicability is a broader and more various, and I would say much more interesting way of writing, such that, especially if you think of it in evangelistic terms, right? Like, if the idea is to try to connect people to Christ, Lewis is kind of coming right out and saying it. But what Tolkien is doing is what Madeline L'Engle describes as shining, and this is the phrase used, a light so lovely that those who see it would want to know the source of it. So it actually kind of calls something forth much more deeply. It's less like a sermon and more like something deeper. As you can tell, I kind of prefer Tolkien to Lewis, although I super love Lewis, don't get me wrong. And I'll tell you this, Lewis actually does achieve this in one of his works, but it's not the Chronicles of Narnia. It's a book called Till We Have Faces. Anyone read that? Yes! What a book, right? And the book is entirely about paganism, but it is one of the most deeply Christian things I've ever read. And it is his most perfect work. It's a literary achievement that's way beyond the Chronicles of Narnia. So there you go. That's a pretty good endorsement. Again, I do not get royalties for promoting these books. Yeah.
I just thought I'd share another example from the scriptures that goes really well with the theme. That's Christ's parable about the sons of the father who owns a farm.
Yes.
He asks the one, will you go out and work in the field? And he says, no, I won't. Then later he feels repentant and goes out and does it. And the other side he says he will and never does.
Yeah, which one of these did the will of his father?
Right.
Not the one who said the right thing. Yeah.
I really love your discussion on the 30-year absence of friendship that we talked about. There's one of the most poignant lines in the Psalms for me is, it was so hard to read.
There have been fears with fear when they did. So, to me, there's a very interesting connection between that. Because what my fear does is it distorts a lot of that.
Right.
You know, he got lost in his fear and didn't realize that really the issue was his behavior. He was feeling reckless. Right?
Yeah.
And he spent all this time in fear. And fear is what blocks me from faith and from a faithful heart often.
Yeah.
Because I'm so wrapped up in some kind of out of proportion. 12-step programs take the word fear and it's an acronym, false evidence of fear removal. You know, begin to realize that my relationship with God is blocked because I'm out of proportion. I'm not seeing things clearly.
Yeah. I mean, notice how fear is one of the key elements in all three of the relationships that I mentioned. Theoden, Frodo, and Boromir. They're all afraid. Yeah.
Two questions. Like a totally different spin. Like you talked a little bit about how I don't understand Lord of the Rings and stuff. So I'm thinking about you as the priest who's really into the fantasy stuff.
I'm not the only one, by the way. We are legion.
But in my world, I see a lot of people who are like atheistic, but they think superhero movies are like amazing, so they want like this heroic nobility to be consumed as entertainment. Is there like a way that we can take things like this and sort of make them an evangelical, like a tool of evangelism? Because some of those people are so, they're like, Jesus couldn't have been real. This is impossible that God could become a person. And then like maybe they have like a Batman sticker on their car. Like in their mind, they really are Batman. Like like they're so into fantasy, but they think that Christ can't be real. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They want to believe absurd things.
Yeah, the desire for the transcendent is built into all of us. You can't escape it. You cannot escape it. I mean, even if you read Nietzsche, right? The prophet of nihilism. He himself reaches towards transcendent metaphysics, which is like crazy. But he does it more honestly than any other atheist out there. We desire the transcendent. Why is it that now, just in like the last 10, 15 years, this is now the golden age of superhero movies? Like, do you know how long it took the Marvel Comics universe to run the full Avengers thing, and how many films that was? It was like 20-some films over 10 years. Why is it that is so crazy popular now, right? It's because what's happened is that our society's collective connection to the transcendent has been eroded significantly. But the good news is that we're still humans, and we still want it. And so as a result, we're reaching towards this kind of thing. And so yeah, I believe that there is a way in, and it's funny because there are Orthodox, for instance, who would utterly denounce this project. Like that imaginative fiction is satanic, that it's damaging to faith, because you're thinking about things that are lies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, I could respond to that in lots of ways, but the number one way I would simply say is, Jesus told stories. Jesus made up fiction in order to teach people things, right? I mean, he knew everything that had ever happened. He could have done history only and been really good at it, but he chose to make up stories. And so the value of things like Tolkien's Legendarium is that it actually, by reading it, by discussing it, by sharing it, it actually shapes our imagination such that we are prepared for the enchanted world. That is to say, a world in which the spiritual reality is detected and not just simply sensed as absent, which is the way that most of us live most of our lives every day. Like, I don't feel anything. Yeah, right? But I've said to people sometimes, for instance, that reading The Lord of the Rings and all of Tolkien's Legendarium throughout my whole childhood and on up to now, that actually prepared me to become an Orthodox Christian, because the kind of Christianity that I was in was basically unenchanted. Whereas in Orthodoxy we say, come on down and eat and drink God. That's different, Or when we say we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, like, we mean there's people here with us right now, the saints who have gone on before us. So yes, it absolutely is evangelistic. I think in some cases we can use it and engage in acts of interpretation and say, see here how this is a Christ figure and so forth. But also I think just simply encouraging people's imagination to be shaped by these things is going to help develop in them the hunger for it and actually clear away some of the nonsense that would prevent them from coming to it. Does that make sense? Yeah. You first, I think. Yeah. You got one earlier.
So like you say these things about telling stories and it being as long as it resonates with people. So one thing that I think resonates with a lot of people is like comedy and humor and stuff. Do you think Jesus was funny? Do you think people laugh like like what would you say?
Have you ever read a book by called Orthodoxy, which has nothing to do with the Orthodox Church, by an author named G.K. Chesterton? Anyone read that? Yes. At the very end of that book, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong here, at the very end of that book, Chesterton says that Jesus showed all of his humanity to us, but there was one thing that he seemed to be holding back. And he said it was his mirth. Do you guys remember this, those who read it? His mirth. In other words, his sense of humor. Now, I disagree with G.K. Chesterton. And here's why. So I live in a town called Emmaus, Pennsylvania. Emmaus, there's only 2 Emmauses in America, which is really surprising because America loves to name towns after places in the Bible. There's like a Goshen in every state, There's a Jerusalem in almost every state. I mean, it goes on and on. I live right near a Bethlehem and a Nazareth, and there's an Ephrata just on the road. I live like in Palestine, basically in Pennsylvania. But there's only 2 Emmauses, and I don't know why this is. There's this dusty little no stoplight, no population place in Texas named Emmaus. And then there's my Emmaus, which has about 11,500 people in 3 square miles. So living in a town called Emmaus, and in a town that's almost uniquely Emmaus in America, I have a lot of occasion to think about Christ on the road to Emmaus. And if you go to Matins, because you all go to Matins, right? On Sunday, every Sunday you go to Matins. And if you don't, it's time to start. There's 11 gospel readings in Matins, and number 5 is Christ on the road to Emmaus. So I think about that a lot. And when Jesus is walking along with Saints Luke and Cleopas, and they're having this conversation together, and he says, basically, what's your deal? Like, why are you walking and you're sad? And they said, are you only a stranger in Jerusalem and do not know the things that have passed in these days? And then he says, what things? That to me is hilarious. Because there is a dramatic irony there, because you the reader know like, well, I know what things, and this is Jesus, he just rose from the dead. He's going, yeah, what things? I don't know that he made that face, I don't think so, but nonetheless, it is a bit of dramatic irony, right? And irony is one of the bases of humor, almost always, right? It's something that's not expected and it's something that's incongruent, right? So I do think, I find that funny, not in a mocking way, but I think it's great, I think it's beautiful. So I think that humor can be done well. There is other humor in the Bible. Like, for instance, some people will tell you should never be sarcastic. The word sarcasm comes from the Greek, it means a tearing of flesh. Right? But, there's a patron saint of sarcasm? I think. The prophet Elias, up on Mount Carmel, when he's in that big showdown with the prophets of Baal, and they're trying to call down lightning from heaven, fire from their God, and he goes, maybe you should call a little bit louder. Maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's on vacation. Like, that is clear sarcasm. Like, he is ridiculing, that's a very ecumenical moment, He is ridiculing the prophets of Baal. So yeah, I would describe him as the patron saint of sarcasm. But it has to be used well. You don't want to use this ability against other people, right? I was a stagehand for 10 years, so I'm just very sarcastic by nature. But I also know it can be very dark if misapplied. Yeah.
So I'm afraid my question might be kind of broad. Hopefully we can address it in the time. But so Bruce was mentioning fear, and we've talked about the what sounds to me like the salvific role of generosity. So I'm trying to connect the dots between another question I wanted to ask you about eucatastrophe.
Yeah.
Is that something you could articulate a little bit more? I don't know if it's a very well-known term, but just, I don't know. I see like that being a generosity sort of at the 11th hour. Would you think so?
Who's heard this word eucatastrophe before? Okay, you are the true believers. All right, so eucatastrophe is a word actually coined by Tolkien. And it's, it's got that beginning EU, in Greek ev, right? And it means true or good. And then catastrophe, like a good catastrophe, right? So the idea of a eucatastrophe is it's when the heroes have struggled as hard as they can, as well as they can, but in the end, what saves the day is not that the heroes themselves are so good or virtuous or strong or clever. What saves the day in the end is that there is a divine action that comes seemingly out of nowhere, but then in retrospect has hooks throughout the whole story, right? So in the case of The Lord of the Rings, the great eucatastrophe at the end is that Frodo, when he gets to the point where he's got the ring, he's about to drop it into the cracks of doom, says, you know what? No, I'm taking it. And he puts it on. Frodo fails. Frodo fails, right? And so then Gollum jumps on him and struggles with him for the ring and bites his finger off. And then Gollum, and this is not the way it works in the movies, they're both fighting and then they kind of fall over the ledge. And Gollum falls all the way and Frodo hangs on by his hand. That's not how it happens in the book. How it happens in the book is they're struggling. Gollum bites the ring from Frodo's finger. Frodo falls down on the ground, beaten basically. And Gollum is jumping around in joy and glee, having finally gotten his precious. And then he just trips and falls. Trips on. It would have been way better in the movie, right? But I think they wanted to make Frodo more heroic, supposedly. But that's exactly not the point of the book. Frodo is not the hero. And so eucatastrophe is that essentially that Eru Iluvatar, who is basically God in Tolkien's Legendarium, steps in and just gives a little nudge. And he does this many places throughout the book, right? And you think about all the things that contributed to that moment. The fact that Gollum wasn't killed when Bilbo had the opportunity and when Frodo had the opportunity. The fact that Boromir tried to take the ring from Frodo and that led him to go off on his own with just Samwise. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. All of these things that are hooks throughout the whole story, and then you get this moment at the end. And Tolkien says that this is absolutely critical for fairy tales. That if they don't have a eucatastrophe, it's not a true fairy tale. It might be a hero story, it might be something else. And Tolkien also says in his amazing essay, which is called On Fairy Stories, which I, again, super recommend and don't get any royalties from if you buy it. He says in there that the greatest eucatastrophe of all was the incarnation and the resurrection of Christ. Because mankind did not achieve his salvation. Mankind struggled, but did not achieve. It took an act of God. And it's not what in classical drama is called a deus ex machina, which means a god out of the machine, which is basically what happens is in these plays by people like Sophocles and so forth, that the characters just make a mess of everything, and then a god walks in and just fixes everything, right? It just comes off as a non sequitur, where it's just like, well, we need to clear the stage, so bring in Zeus, and he's called Deus Ex Machina because he was sort of lifted in on a crane, a machine. That's not what a eucatastrophe is. It's not a Deus Ex Machina. It fits with the story. It fits with the story. That's why the Lord Jesus can be called the Lamb slain from when? The foundation of the world. In other words, this was programmed into the whole creation from the very beginning. But it's only now, this unexpected turn, bam, which is described in Scripture and, of course, the patristic tradition in liturgical life as God tricking Satan. Think about, I'm sorry, I'm on a roll here. You think about Chrysostom's homily at Pascha. Hell took a body and it met God. Gotcha. Right? That's what happens. So you can see why that characteristic of story is actually deeply, deeply Christian. And any story that's got that, that's one I want my kids to be reading. Because it's going to give them that love and that hunger for that. It's not going to be that the race goes to the swift and the battle to the strong. That is not the way this ends out. That's a pagan idea. Thank you for that.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Father. We are out of time. Just want to let everyone know that lunch is starting immediately after this, so start heading down there. If we could give Father a round of applause. Thank you very much.
And I have one very small plug to make, may I?
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you. Well, now as I said that, you're going to have to let me. Next year, and yes, this will probably compete somewhat with this conference, but next year, if you're not here, the place that you should be is in Chicago for the first ever Christ and Tolkien Conference. It'll be happening October 1st through 3rd, sponsored by Ancient Faith Ministries, but it is broadly Christian, so there will be Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox all coming together in their love for Jesus Christ and Tolkien and sharing not just lectures, but also like trivia contests and music and movies, and it'll be a real con, like a conference, right, like a convention, but it still have both a scholarly side and a sort of a fandom side. All those things are going to be happening together. If you're interested in that, these are little save-the-date cards, which you can get, which will be put right here.
Thank you very much.
The main speakers are Dr. Bradley Berzer, who wrote the book J.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, Dr. Lisa Kutras, who wrote Tolkien's Theology of Beauty, and then Dr. Cyril Gary Jenkins, who's a history professor whom I know well and also has a great love for Tolkien. So those are the main people. Thank you.